Sometimes the hardest truths come from the smallest voices. In the dusty frontier town of Cedar Ridge, a hungry little girl's whispered plea would change 2 lives forever. Set in the rugged 1800s frontier, a starving child reveals her desperate situation to a wealthy cattleman, unaware she's speaking to the father she's never known. Years ago, the cowboy's brief romance with her late mother left behind a daughter he never knew existed. Now facing the girl's hunger and innocent eyes, the hardened rancher must confront the mistakes of his past and the choices he tried to forget. He built his fortune on cattle and land, but can he build the courage to claim the family he abandoned? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something truly extra special for you. The sun had not yet crested the rolling hills when James Crawford stepped onto the wide porch of his ranch house, coffee steam rising from his tin cup like morning prayers. At 43, Big Jim, as the folks in Cedar Ridge called him, commanded respect from the Kansas plains to the Colorado territories. His Broken Arrow Ranch stretched across 12,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land west of the Mississippi, where 2,000 head of prime Hereford cattle dotted the landscape like scattered pennies. The house behind him stood as a testament to his success. 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with glass windows shipped clear from St. Louis, and a wraparound porch that could accommodate the entire town council when they came calling for donations or favors. Inside, Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and oil paintings of pastoral scenes hung in gilded frames. It was the kind of home that spoke of permanence, of a man who had planted deep roots in unforgiving soil. But this morning, like so many others, Jim stood alone. He walked to the barn where his foreman, Miguel Santos, was already tending to the horses. Miguel had worked the Broken Arrow for 15 years, arriving as a young vaquero with calloused hands and an honest face. Now gray touched his temples, and his weathered features carried the wisdom of a man who understood both cattle and the hearts of men. "Morning, Patron," Miguel said, not looking up from the bridle he was mending. "The boys brought in 3 strays. From the north pasture yesterday. That old bull of yours, Goliath, seems to think he can bust through any fence we put up." Jim chuckled, a sound that carried easily in the crisp morning air. "That bull's got more determination than sense. Reminds me of someone I used to know." He paused, watching Miguel's skilled hands work the leather. "Any word from town?" "See. Doc Henderson sent word that Mrs. Kowalski had her baby, a healthy boy. Makes number 7 for them." Miguel's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Also heard tell that the railroad might finally extend the line through Cedar Ridge next year. Could mean good things for shipping cattle east." Jim nodded thoughtfully. Progress was coming to their corner of the world, slowly but surely. The frontier was taming itself, one railroad track and one settled family at a time. Sometimes he wondered if he'd chosen to build his empire at the perfect moment. Early enough to claim the best land, late enough to benefit from the civilization that followed. "I'll be riding into town this morning," Jim said. "Need to check on the supply order at Morrison's store, and the bank manager wants to discuss expanding the loan program for smaller ranchers." Miguel looked up then, studying his boss with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to read the moods of weather, animals, and men. "Everything all right, Patron? You've seemed distracted lately." Jim paused in the act of adjusting his hat, considering the question. Distracted was perhaps too mild a word for the restlessness that had settled into his bones like winter cold. Success had brought him everything he'd thought he wanted: respect, wealth, influence. But in the quiet hours before dawn, when sleep eluded him and he found himself walking the empty rooms of his house, he wondered what legacy he was truly building. "Just thinking about the future," Jim said finally. "A man reaches a certain age, starts wondering what he'll leave behind. You've got the finest ranch in 3 counties, Patron. That's something to be proud of." "Yes," Jim agreed, though something in his voice suggested the word carried more weight than certainty. An hour later, Jim guided his horse Thunder down the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge. The town had grown considerably since he'd first arrived 20 years ago with nothing but ambition and a fierce determination to prove himself. What had been a collection of rough timber buildings and tent shops was now a proper settlement, with a school, a church, a newspaper office, and even a small opera house where traveling performers occasionally graced the stage. Morrison's General Store occupied a prime corner lot, its wide windows displaying everything from bolts of calico and sacks of flour to hand tools and penny candy. The wooden sidewalk creaked pleasantly under Jim's boots as he pushed through the door, setting off the brass bell that announced customers. "Morning, Jim," called Albert Morrison from behind the counter. Albert was a thin man with spectacles, perpetually perched on the end of his nose, the kind of merchant who remembered every customer's preferences and could calculate complex orders in his head faster than most men could work an abacus. "Morning, Albert. That supply order come in." "Yet most of it. Still waiting on the barbed wire from Chicago, but everything else is here." Albert pulled out a ledger and ran his finger down a column of figures. "Comes to $47.36, including the freight charges." As Jim counted out the money, he noticed Albert glancing toward the store's front window with a troubled expression. Following his gaze, Jim saw a small figure huddled near the wooden steps, a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, wearing a faded dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. "That little girl been out there long?" Jim asked. Albert sighed, removing his spectacles to clean them with unnecessary attention. "Sarah Washington. Comes by most days, hoping folks might need an errand run or have some small job for her. Her grandmother Ruth takes in mending when she's able, but—" He shook his head. "Times are hard for them, Jim. Real hard." Jim studied the child through the window. Even from a distance, he could see the careful way she held herself, the dignity she maintained despite her circumstances. Her dark skin marked her as one of the few colored families in Cedar Ridge, descendants of freed slaves who had headed west seeking the same opportunities as everyone else, though they often found those opportunities more elusive. "What happened to her parents?" Jim asked, though something in his chest tightened as he waited for the answer. "Mother died when Sarah was born. Never knew who the father was. Clara Washington kept that secret to her grave. Ruth's been raising the girl alone, but she's getting on in years and her health ain't what it used to be." Albert replaced his spectacles and looked at Jim meaningfully. "Some folks in town have been talking about sending Sarah to her mother's. My cousin in Louisiana, thinking she might have better prospects there." The words hit Jim like a physical blow, though he couldn't understand why. He'd never paid particular attention to the Washington family before, though he knew them by sight, as he knew most folks in Cedar Ridge. But something about the idea of that small, proud figure being sent away stirred an unexpected protectiveness in him. "She seems like a good child," Jim said carefully. "Oh, she is. Smart as a whip, too. Clara saw to her education before she passed, and Ruth's continued it best she can. Sarah can read and write better than some grown folks, and she's got a head for numbers that would make a banker proud." Albert's voice softened with genuine affection. "But book learning don't put food on the table or keep the roof from leaking." Jim pulled out his wallet and extracted a $5 bill, placing it on the counter. "Next time she comes in, see that she gets some supplies for her grandmother. Flour, beans, salt pork, whatever they need. Tell them it's from someone who appreciates hard work and good character." Albert's eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded and tucked the money into his cash drawer. "That's mighty generous of you, Jim. Though Ruth Washington's a proud woman, she might not accept charity. Then tell her it's payment for services rendered." Jim said, "I'm sure the girls helped folks around town in ways worth compensating." As Jim left the store, he found himself walking more slowly than usual, his attention drawn to the small figure still waiting by the steps. She had positioned herself where she could see everyone coming and going, her dark eyes alert for any opportunity. When she noticed him approaching, she straightened, preparing to speak, but Jim found himself at a loss for words. Something about Her face, the intelligent way she assessed him, the careful dignity in her posture despite her obvious poverty, struck him with unexpected force. For just a moment, looking into those expressive eyes, he felt an odd sense of recognition, as if he were seeing something familiar in an unfamiliar place. "Good morning, sir," Sarah said, her voice clear and polite. "Would you happen to need any errands run? I know this town better than most, and I'm reliable." Her grammar was precise, her manner courteous but not servile. This was a child who had been taught to respect herself as well as others, despite circumstances that might have broken a lesser spirit. "Good morning," Jim replied, tipping his hat. "Sarah, isn't it?" Surprise flickered across her features that he knew her name. "Yes, sir, Sarah Washington. I'm James Crawford. Folks call me Big Jim." He studied her face, that strange sense of familiarity growing stronger. "Mr. Morrison tells me you're quite helpful around town." A small smile brightened her features, transforming her solemn expression into something that made Jim's breath catch unexpectedly. "I do my best, sir. Grandmother always says idleness is the devil's workshop, so I try to keep busy." Wise words. Jim reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, holding it out to her. "For being courteous to a stranger." Sarah looked at the coin as if it were a small miracle, but she didn't immediately reach for it. "What would you like me to do for it, sir? I don't take money I haven't earned." The simple dignity of her response, the quiet pride that wouldn't accept unearned charity, struck Jim with admiration and something else he couldn't quite name. Here was a child who understood the value of honest work, who maintained her principles even in the face of obvious need. "Well then," Jim said, "perhaps you could direct me to the best place in town for a noon meal. I've been away on business and could use a local's recommendation." "That would be Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, sir. She serves dinner from 11:30 to 1 o'clock, and her apple pie is talked about as far away as Dodge City." Sarah accepted the coin with a small curtsy. "Thank you kindly, Mr. Crawford." As she hurried away, probably to share the news of her good fortune with her grandmother, Jim stood watching until she disappeared around a corner. That strange feeling of recognition lingered, accompanied by something he hadn't experienced in years. A sense that his carefully ordered world had just shifted in some fundamental way. Walking back to where Thunder waited patiently at the hitching post, Jim couldn't shake the image of Sarah's face, particularly that moment when she'd smiled. Something about her features, the shape of her eyes, the way she carried herself, tugged at memories he'd thought long buried. He pulled out his worn leather journal from his saddlebag, a habit he'd maintained for years. The journal contained more than just cattle counts and business transactions. It held fragments of his life, observations, and occasionally memories he'd tried to forget. As he flipped through pages of neat handwriting, his fingers paused at entries from 9 years ago. There, in his younger self's careful script, were notes about a woman named Clara, brief mentions of rides taken together, conversations shared. Feelings he'd been too proud or too foolish to fully acknowledge at the time. Clara Washington. The name that Albert Morrison had spoken with such gentle sympathy. Jim's hand trembled slightly as he closed the journal. Coincidence? Surely. Cedar Ridge wasn't such a large place that 2 women named Clara Washington could have lived here. But the Clara he remembered had been beautiful, intelligent, and kind. Qualities he'd just witnessed reflected in a small girl's face. The sun climbed higher as Jim rode home, but the warmth couldn't dispel the chill that had settled around his heart. Memory was a treacherous thing, capable of playing tricks on a man, but some truths had a way of announcing themselves whether you were ready to hear them or not. By the time he reached the Broken Arrow, Jim Crawford knew his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet fathom. The only question was whether he'd have the courage to face whatever truth was waiting for him. 3 days passed before Jim returned to Cedar Ridge, but the image of Sarah Washington's face had not left his thoughts. He found himself making excuses for the trip, checking on a grain shipment that wouldn't arrive for another week, discussing cattle prices that hadn't changed since his last visit, anything that might bring him back to the dusty main street, where he'd encountered the girl with the familiar eyes. This time, he approached Morrison's store with a different purpose, though he couldn't quite admit to himself what that purpose might be. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden sidewalk, and a handful of early customers moved in and out of the various shops with the unhurried pace of people who measured time by seasons rather than hours. As he tied Thunder to the hitching post, Jim noticed a small commotion near the alley that ran between Morrison's store and the blacksmith shop. A group of children had gathered, their voices carrying the particular tone that accompanied childhood drama. Moving closer, he could see Sarah Washington at the center of the group, facing down two boys who were considerably larger than she. "Give it back, Tommy Fletcher," Sarah was saying, her voice steady despite the tears Jim could see threatening at the corners of her eyes. "That ribbon belonged to my mama." Tommy Fletcher, a red-haired boy of perhaps 12, with the kind of smirk that suggested he was accustomed to getting his way through intimidation, held something blue and delicate just out of Sarah's reach. "What's it worth to you?" he taunted. "Maybe if you ask real nice—" "She asked nice the first time," interrupted Mary Henderson, the doctor's daughter, stepping forward with the kind of courage that runs in families dedicated to helping others. "You're being mean, Tommy Fletcher, and your mama would tan your hide if she knew." But Tommy only laughed, dangling the ribbon higher. "Ain't nothing but a piece of old cloth. Don't know why He paused, his eyes flicking to the adults who were beginning to notice the disturbance and seemed to reconsider his choice of words. But the malice in his expression remained. Jim found himself moving before he'd consciously decided to intervene. His boots made solid sounds on the wooden planks as he approached the group, and something in his bearing caused the children to fall silent. "Son," Jim said to Tommy, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I believe the young lady asked for her property back." Tommy's bravado withered under Jim's steady gaze. The boy was old enough to recognize real power when he encountered it, and James Crawford commanded respect throughout the territory. Without a word, Tommy dropped the ribbon and scurried away, his companion following close behind. Sarah bent to retrieve the fallen ribbon, handling it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred objects. As she straightened, Jim could see the item clearly for the first time, a length of faded blue silk, worn soft with age, and a careful handling, the kind of ribbon a woman might wear in her hair for special occasions. "Thank you, sir," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. She tried to smile, but the expression wavered. "It was my mama's. It's all I have left." "Of her." The simple words hit Jim with unexpected force. He looked more closely at the ribbon, and suddenly his breath caught in his throat. Blue silk faded to the color of a winter sky. He knew that ribbon. He had seen it countless times, woven through dark hair that caught the light like spun silk, worn by a woman whose laughter could make even the hardest man feel young again. "Your mother," Jim said carefully, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "She was Clara Washington." Sarah nodded, surprise flickering across her features. "Yes." "Sir, did you know her?" The question hung in the air between them like a bridge Jim wasn't sure he was ready to cross. Around them, the normal sounds of the town continued. Horses' hooves on packed earth, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, conversations drifting from the storefronts. But Jim felt as if he and Sarah existed in a bubble of suspended time. Yes, I knew her," Jim managed. "She was a kind woman, a good woman." Sarah's face brightened with the particular joy that comes from hearing a beloved memory validated by someone else. "She was. Grandmother tells me stories about her, but it's wonderful to meet someone else who remembers her kindly." She paused, studying Jim's face with those sharp, intelligent eyes. "Were you friends?" Friends. Such a simple word to describe something that had been far more complicated. Jim remembered Clara's laugh, the way she'd challenge his opinions with gentle humor, the conversations that had stretched long into summer evenings on the porch of her small house at the edge of town. He remembered the way she'd looked at him, with eyes full of hope and trust, and the way that trust had crumbled when he'd chosen his family's expectations over his own heart. "We were acquainted," Jim said, the careful neutrality of the words feeling like cowardice. She was well regarded in the community. Something in Sarah's expression suggested she sensed there was more to the story, but she was too polite to press. Instead, she carefully tucked the ribbon into her dress pocket, treating it like the treasure it clearly was. "Mr. Crawford," Sarah said suddenly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. She glanced around to make sure they weren't overheard, then looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her young face. "I'm so poor I have nothing to eat." The words were spoken without self-pity, stated a simple fact, the way another child might comment on the weather, but they hit Jim like a physical blow, carrying with them the weight of genuine desperation hidden beneath carefully maintained dignity. "What did you say?" Jim asked, though he'd heard her perfectly. "I'm so poor I have nothing to eat," Sarah repeated, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was admitting. "Grandmother tries her best, but her hands hurt too much to do much mending anymore, and I can't earn enough running errands to buy what we need. I wouldn't ask, sir. But," she paused, gathering courage, "but you were kind before, and I thought perhaps you might know of some work I could do." Jim stared down at this small, proud child who was asking for help in the only way her dignity would allow. The blue ribbon in her pocket, her careful grammar, the way she'd faced down bullies twice her size. Everything about Sarah spoke of strength inherited from a woman who had faced her own struggles with similar grace. "How long has it been since you've had a proper meal?" Jim asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. Sarah considered the question with the seriousness of a merchant calculating inventory. 3 days since we had meat. Grandmother made soup from bones the butcher was going to throw away, but we finished that yesterday. Today, we have a little flour left and some water." The matter-of-fact way she recited their poverty made it somehow more heartbreaking than if she'd wept. This was a child who had learned to face hardship with the same steady courage her mother had once shown, accepting reality while still fighting to change it. Jim reached into his pocket and pulled out a $10 bill, more money than Sarah had probably seen in her entire young life. But as he held it out, she stepped back, shaking her head. "I can't take charity, sir. I have to earn what I'm given." Even starving, even desperate, she maintained the principles that had clearly been instilled in her from birth. Jim felt a surge of admiration so strong it almost overwhelmed him. This child possessed the kind of character that couldn't be bought or taught. It had to be inherited, passed down from parent to child like eye color or the shape of one's hands. "Then let's call it payment in advance," Jim said gently. "I have some correspondence that needs organizing at my ranch, and I could use someone with good handwriting and careful attention to detail. Would you be willing to help with that?" Sarah's eyes lit up with relief and something that might have been hope. "Oh, yes, sir. I write a fine hand, and I'm very careful with important papers." "I'm sure you are." Jim pressed the money into her small hands, noting how cold her fingers were despite the warm day. "Get yourself and your grandmother some food, and come to the Broken Arrow Ranch tomorrow morning. Do you know where it is?" "Yes, sir. Everyone knows the Broken Arrow." Sarah clutched the money as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "Thank you, Mr. Crawford. Thank you so very much." As she hurried away, probably to share the good news with her grandmother, Jim stood watching until she disappeared around the corner. Then he walked slowly back to where Thunder waited, his mind reeling with implications he wasn't ready to examine. Inside Morrison's store, Albert looked up from his ledger with knowing eyes. "Heard you helped young Sarah out there. Tommy Fletcher's always been a bully, even when his pa's around to check him." "She mentioned she's been having hard times," Jim said, trying to keep his voice casual. "Seemed like she could use a helping hand." "That she could." Albert set down his pen and leaned against the counter. "You know, Jim, I've been in this town for 15 years, and I've watched a lot of folks grow up. That little girl has something special about her, a strength that comes from good breeding, if you take my meaning." Jim's pulse quickened. "What do you mean by that?" "Well, her mother was quality. No matter what some folks might say about her circumstances, Clara Washington was educated, refined, had a way about her that spoke of better beginnings than most folks who end up in a frontier town. Albert paused meaningfully. Of course, she never talked much about where she came from or who she knew before Cedar Ridge. Kept her own counsel, that one. And the father? Never any speculation about who that might have been. Albert's expression became carefully neutral. Oh, there was talk, naturally. Small town like this, people always wonder. But Clara never said a word, not even to her closest friends. Some secrets a person takes to the grave. As Jim rode home that afternoon, Clara's blue ribbon filled his thoughts. He remembered buying it for her at a traveling merchant's wagon, remembered the way her face had lit up when he'd presented it to her, remembered weaving it through her hair with hands that trembled slightly at the intimacy of the gesture. He also remembered the last time he'd seen her wear it, the night he'd told her their courtship had to end, that his father's plans for his future didn't include a poor seamstress, regardless of her qualities. The night he'd chosen duty and expectation over love, and broke both their hearts in the process. Now that ribbon was in his daughter's pocket, for he could no longer deny what his heart had known the moment he'd truly looked at Sarah's face. The timeline matched, the resemblance was unmistakable, and most telling of all was the character she displayed, a combination of Clara's gentle strength and something that reminded him powerfully of his own family's stubborn pride. "I'm so poor. I have nothing to eat." The words echoed in his mind as the broken arrow came into view. His daughter was starving while he lived in comfort, built on the fortune he'd chosen over her mother's love. The weight of that realization settled on his shoulders like a yoke, and James Crawford understood that his life had just divided into two parts: everything that had happened before this moment and everything that would happen after. That evening, Jim sat in his study long after the sun had disappeared behind the western hills, staring at the glass of whiskey he'd poured but hadn't touched. The room around him represented everything he'd worked to achieve: leather-bound books lining the walls, a massive oak desk inherited from his father, maps of his property marked with careful annotations in his own hand. It was the study of a successful man, a man who had built something lasting from nothing but determination and ruthless focus. Yet tonight, surrounded by the symbols of his accomplishments, Jim felt like a stranger in his own life. The image of Sarah's face haunted him, the way she'd held that blue ribbon with such reverence, the dignity with which she'd admitted her desperate circumstances, the familiar intelligence that sparkled in her dark eyes. Those eyes that looked so much like Clara's, set in features that bore an unmistakable resemblance to his own family. Unable to sit still any longer, Jim rose and walked to the massive safe that stood in the corner of his study. The combination had been his father's birthday, then his mother's after the old man passed, and finally a date that held significance only for Jim himself, the day he'd first met Clara Washington. The safe contained the usual items one might expect from a wealthy rancher: land deeds, banknotes, contracts, and legal papers. But hidden behind the business documents, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth, was a small wooden box that Jim hadn't opened in over 8 years. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the box from its hiding place and carried it to his desk. The wood was smooth from years of handling, crafted by a local carpenter who specialized in fine pieces for special occasions. Jim had commissioned it originally to hold Clara's engagement ring back when he'd been young enough to believe that love could conquer the practical realities of frontier life. The box opened with a soft click, revealing contents that transported him instantly back to a time when the world had seemed full of possibilities instead of obligations. There, carefully preserved, were the physical remnants of the most honest relationship he'd ever known. A pressed wildflower, purple and delicate, from their first picnic by Cedar Creek. Clara had tucked it behind her ear while they'd talked about their dreams, and later she'd given it to him with a shy smile, saying flowers were meant to be shared with people who appreciated their beauty. A small sketch Clara had drawn of him, done in pencil on paper, she'd probably couldn't afford to spare. It showed him laughing at something she'd said, captured with an artist's eye for the moment when a person's true nature showed through their carefully constructed facades. Looking at it now, Jim could barely recognize the young man who'd been capable of such unguarded joy. A theatre ticket stub from the travelling Shakespeare company that had performed in Cedar Ridge's modest opera house. They'd seen Romeo and Juliet, and afterward, Clara had teased him about the tragic ending, saying she preferred stories where love found a way to triumph over circumstances. Jim had kissed her that night for the first time, standing in the shadows behind the theatre, and believed with all his heart that their story would have the happy ending she favoured. But it was the letter that made his breath catch in his throat. 3 pages of Clara's careful handwriting on cream-coloured paper that still carried the faint scent of the lavender sachets she'd kept in her dresser drawer. "My dearest James," it began, and just reading those words brought her voice flooding back to his memory, soft and warm, with the slight musical accent that hinted at her Louisiana origins. "I write this letter knowing I may never have the courage to give it to you, but I find I must put these words somewhere, even if they only live on paper. You asked me yesterday what I see when I look at the future, and I found myself unable to answer, not because I don't know, but because the truth seems too wonderful to speak aloud. When I imagine tomorrow, and all the tomorrows that might follow, I see morning coffee shared in comfortable silence, and evening conversations that stretch long into the night. I see your hands teaching our children to hold a rope properly, and my voice reading them stories by lamplight. I see us growing old together, surrounded by the life we've built with our own hands and hearts. I know such dreams may seem presumptuous for a woman in my circumstances, and I know your family has plans for your future that likely don't include a poor seamstress with more hope than prospects. But love makes dreamers of us all, doesn't it? And I find myself dreaming of a life where circumstances matter less than the content of our hearts. You are a good man, James Crawford, better than, you see people for who they truly are, not what society tells you they should be. You listen when others merely wait for their turn to speak. You have the kind of strength that protects rather than dominates, and the kind of wisdom that comes from understanding both your own limitations and your capacity for growth. Whatever happens between us, whatever choices we must make to honor our responsibilities and respect our family's wishes, I want you to know that loving you has made me a better woman. You have shown me that I am worthy of kindness, of respect, of consideration. That alone is a gift I will treasure all my life. But oh, my darling, how I hope we might treasure much more than that together. All my love, always, Clara. Jim's hands shook as he read the letter through twice, each word cutting deeper than the last. Here, in Clara's own hand, was proof of the love he'd thrown away, the future he'd sacrificed on the altar of social expectations and family pressure. She had seen their life together with such clarity, had believed in a happiness that he'd convinced himself was impossible. The cruelest part was how accurately she'd predicted his family's objections. His father had made his position clear the moment he'd learned about Jim's attachment to that colored girl, as he'd put it with characteristic bluntness. The Crawford name carried weight in the territory, and that weight came with responsibilities. Jim would marry appropriately, continue the family line with someone of suitable background, and build the dynasty his grandfather had envisioned when he'd first claimed land in Kansas. Jim had been 24 then, young enough to still believe that duty and love might somehow coexist, but old enough to understand the realities of inheritance and social standing. His father controlled the ranch, the money, and therefore Jim's future. Choose Clara, he'd been told, and lose everything else. Choose duty, and Clara would understand eventually. Except Clara had never understood. And why should she? Jim had. Never explained the pressure he was under, never asked her to wait while he found a way to reconcile his obligations with his heart. He'd simply appeared at her door one evening and told her, with all the warmth of a business transaction, that their courtship was over. The memory of that conversation still had the power to make him wince. Clara hadn't argued or pleaded. She'd simply listened with growing comprehension, then nodded once and thanked him for his honesty. But her eyes, those expressive, intelligent eyes that Sarah had inherited, had held a pain so deep it had haunted his dreams for months afterward. Now, holding her letter in his hands, Jim realized that Clara had understood far more than he'd given her credit for. She'd known about his family's expectations, had recognized the impossible position he was in, and had loved him anyway. The letter proved she'd been prepared to accept whatever decision he made, even if it broke her heart. But she'd also been prepared to hope, to dream of a future where love might triumph over circumstance, and he'd crushed that hope as thoroughly as if he'd ground it under his boot heel. The worst part, the knowledge that now threatened to tear him apart, was that his sacrifice had been meaningless. Yes, he'd inherited the ranch when his father died 3 years later. Yes, he'd built it into something even larger and more profitable than the old man had imagined. But he'd never married the suitable woman his family had in mind. He'd told himself it was because he was too busy with business, too focused on building his empire to take time for courtship. The truth was simpler and more damning. He'd never met another woman who made him feel the way Clara had. No one else had combined her intelligence with her kindness, her strength with her gentleness, her ability to challenge him while supporting him. He'd spent nearly 20 years looking for someone who could fill the space Clara had occupied in his heart, and he'd failed completely. Meanwhile, Clara had been raising their daughter alone. Their daughter, who was now hungry and desperate, facing the possibility of being sent away to strangers because the man who should have been protecting her was too much of a coward to even acknowledge her existence. Jim carefully folded the letter and placed it back in the box, his movements deliberate and reverent. Tomorrow, Sarah would come to the ranch, and he would have to look into eyes that mirrored her mother's, while pretending he was simply offering employment to a needy child. The thought made him feel sick with shame and anticipation in equal measure. But tonight, alone in his study with the evidence of his greatest failure spread before him, Jim made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days before. He couldn't undo the past, couldn't bring Clara back or erase the years of loneliness and struggle he'd caused her. But he could acknowledge the truth he'd been running from for 9 years. Sarah Washington was his daughter, and it was time to figure out what that meant for both of them. The next morning brought unseasonably cool air and grey clouds that promised rain before noon. Jim dressed with unusual care, choosing clothes that suggested prosperity without ostentation. A businessman conducting routine affairs rather than a man whose world had tilted on its axis overnight. He needed information, and getting it would require the kind of careful navigation that had made him successful in cattle trading and land acquisition. His first stop was Doc Henderson's office, a neat wooden building next to the church where the good doctor had been tending to Cedar Ridge's ailments for over 15 years. Henderson was the kind of man who inspired confidence, methodical, discreet, and possessed of the particular wisdom that came from witnessing both the best and worst moments of human existence. The doctor was organizing medical supplies when Jim entered, his movements efficient despite his 60-odd years. Henderson looked up with genuine pleasure, wiping his hands on a clean cloth before extending one in greeting. "Jim Crawford, good to see you. Not here for yourself, I hope? You look healthy as one of your prize bulls." "No complaints on that front, Doc. Actually, I wanted to ask you about doing some charity work, anonymous donations, to help folks who might be struggling but too proud to ask for help directly." Henderson's eyebrows rose with interest. "That's thoughtful of you, Jim. Did you have particular families in mind?" "Well, I've noticed young Sarah Washington seems to be having a hard time of it. Her grandmother's health isn't what it used to be." Jim kept his voice carefully neutral, as if discussing the weather. "Thought I might arrange for some medical care, food deliveries, that sort of thing." The doctor's expression grew serious. and he gestured for Jim to take a seat in one of the wooden chairs that served as a waiting area. "That's very generous. Ruth Washington is a proud woman, but pride doesn't cure arthritis or put food on the table. She's been avoiding coming in for treatment because she can't afford it, but her condition is worsening." "What about Sarah? She seems healthy enough, but—" "Oh, that child is remarkable," Henderson interrupted, his face lighting up with genuine admiration. "Strong as a young oak tree despite the circumstances, but she's been carrying burdens no 8-year-old should. After Bear took over most of the household duties when Ruth's hands got too painful for fine work." Jim leaned forward slightly, trying to appear casually interested rather than desperately invested. "I've heard conflicting stories about her background. Some say her mother died in childbirth." Henderson's expression grew solemn. "That's right. I delivered Sarah myself, actually. Difficult birth. Clara was a small woman, and there were complications. She lived just long enough to hold her daughter and name her." The doctor paused, his eyes growing distant with memory. "Clara Washington was one of the finest women I've ever known. Educated, gentle, but with a core of steel when she needed." And the father?" Jim asked, his heart hammering against his ribs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, studying Jim's face with the practiced eye of a man accustomed to reading people's true concerns beneath their stated questions. "Clara never said. Not to me, not to anyone, as far as I know, but—" He hesitated, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "But what, Doc?" "Well, this is just an old man's observation, understand. But Clara Washington didn't strike me as the type of woman to be careless with her affections. If she found herself with child, there was a man she loved deeply who, for whatever reason, couldn't or wouldn't marry her." Henderson's gaze sharpened slightly. "Course, there could be any number of reasons for such a situation. Family pressure, social expectations, prior commitments. Did she ever mention anyone specifically? Anyone who might have cared for her? Not in so many words." Henderson rose and walked to his medicine cabinet, ostensibly organizing bottles, but clearly using the movement to consider his response. "But I remember her mentioning once that she understood why some choices had to be made, even when they broke people's hearts. She said forgiveness was easier than blame, and that love didn't always lead to the endings people hoped for." The words hit Jim like physical blows. Clara had forgiven him, had understood the impossible position he'd been in, even as she'd faced pregnancy and eventual death alone. The generosity of spirit that had allowed her to find peace with his betrayal made his guilt feel exponentially heavier. Was she happy? After Sarah was born, I mean. Henderson turned back to face him, and Jim saw compassion in the older man's eyes, along with something that might have been suspicion. As happy as any woman could be in her circumstances. She adored that child, saw her as a gift rather than a burden, spent her last months making sure Ruth knew everything she'd need to care for Sarah properly. He paused. "You're asking very specific questions about a woman who's been dead for 8 years, Jim. Mind if I ask why?" Jim felt heat rise in his cheeks, but forced himself to maintain eye contact. "I'm thinking of setting up a fund to help children who've lost their parents, want to understand what they've been through, how best to help them." It was a weak explanation, and Henderson's expression suggested he found it less than convincing, but the doctor simply nodded and returned to his chair. "Well, if you're serious about helping Sarah, she could use medical attention. Nothing urgent. But I'd like to check her general health. Make sure she's developing properly, despite the nutritional challenges. And Ruth definitely needs treatment for her arthritis. There are things I can do to ease her pain, help her maintain some use of her hands. Consider it done. Send the bills to me, but don't mention my name to them. Tell them it's been arranged by someone who appreciates hard work and good character." Henderson smiled. "I think I can manage that. Though Ruth Washington isn't easily fooled, she may figure out where the help is coming from." As Jim prepared to leave, Henderson cleared his throat. "Jim, I hope you don't mind some unsolicited advice from an old man who's seen a lot of life." "Of course not, Doc. Sometimes the things we think we can't undo turn out to be less permanent than we imagined. And sometimes the courage to do the right thing comes to us later than we'd like, but not too late to matter. Henderson's eyes were kind but penetrating. Guilt is a heavy load to carry, but it's not nearly as heavy as regret. Jim left the doctor's office with his mind spinning. Henderson clearly suspected something, though whether he'd connected Jim specifically to Clara or was simply offering general wisdom was unclear. What was clear was that Clara had lived her final years with grace and forgiveness, focusing on her daughter's future rather than dwelling on disappointments. His next stop was the town records office, housed in the back room of the courthouse, where elderly clerk Marcus Winters maintained Cedar Ridge's official documents with meticulous care. Winters had been recording births, deaths, marriages, and property transfers for over 20 years, and his memory for details was legendary. "Afternoon, Mr. Crawford," Winters said, looking up from a ledger where he was entering property deed information in his precise handwriting. "What can I do for you today?" "I'm researching some genealogical information for a family history project," Jim said, using the cover story he'd prepared. "Wondering if I could take a look at some birth records from about 8 or 9 years ago." Winters nodded agreeably and moved to a cabinet filled with carefully organized files. "Any particular names you're looking for?" "Sarah Washington, born in 1867, I believe." Winters pulled out a thick folder and began thumbing through documents. "Ah, yes, here we are. Sarah Elizabeth Washington, born June 15th, 1867. Mother Clara. Washington, father—" He paused, squinting at the document. "Father listed as unknown." "May I see the certificate?" Winters handed over a piece of official paper bearing the territorial seal. Jim's hands trembled slightly as he read the details, which confirmed everything he'd already suspected. Sarah had been born exactly 9 months after the last night he'd spent with Clara, the night before he'd ended their relationship. But it was a notation in the margin, written in different ink and clearly added later, that stopped his breath entirely. In Clara's careful handwriting were the words, "Father, James Crawford of Broken Arrow Ranch. He does not know." Jim stared at the notation, his vision blurring slightly. Clara had known, had been certain enough to record it officially, but had chosen to protect him from the knowledge and the obligation it would have created. Even facing death, she'd kept his secret while ensuring Sarah would have a record of her true parentage. "Interesting notation there," Winters observed mildly. "Added after the original certificate was filed, looks like. Mrs. Washington came in about 6 months before she died. Said she wanted to update the record for historical accuracy. Did she say anything else about it? Just that truth? Had its own value even when it couldn't change anything practical?" Winters studied Jim's face with the sharp intelligence that had made him an excellent keeper of records and secrets alike. "She also asked me to keep the information confidential unless someone with legitimate interest came asking about it specifically." Jim handed back the certificate with hands that shook slightly. "And what would constitute legitimate interest?" "Well," Winters said slowly, "I'd say a man asking about his own daughter would qualify. Wouldn't you, Mr. Crawford?" The words hung in the air between them like a challenge and an invitation. Jim met the old clerk's eyes and saw understanding, patience, and perhaps a hint of approval. "Yes," Jim said quietly, "I believe it would." As he walked back to where Thunder waited, Jim felt the weight of absolute certainty settling on his shoulders. Sarah Washington was his daughter, Clara had known it, and at least 2 other people in town had suspected it. The only question now was what he intended to do with that knowledge. The rain that had been threatening all morning finally began to fall, a gentle patter that promised to settle the dust and nourish the grasslands. Jim stood for a moment in the rain, letting it wash over him like a baptism, feeling as if he were emerging from one life and preparing to enter another. Tomorrow his daughter would come to his ranch, and he would have to decide whether to continue living the lie of ignorance or find the courage to claim the family he'd abandoned 8 years ago. Sarah arrived at the Broken Arrow Ranch precisely at 8 o'clock the following morning, walking the 3 miles from town with the steady determination of someone accustomed to long distances and hard work. Jim watched her approach from his study window, noting how she paused at the gate to smooth her dress and check that her hair was properly pinned before walking up the long drive. She wore the same mended dress as before, but it had been carefully cleaned and pressed. Her hair was braided with a precision that spoke of Ruth's patient teaching, despite the old woman's arthritic hands. In one arm, she carried a small bundle that Jim couldn't quite make out from the distance. When Miguel opened the door to her polite knock, Jim heard her clear voice explaining that Mr. Crawford was expecting her. There was no deference in her tone, but no presumption either, simply the confidence of a child who had been taught that honest work earned respect from anyone worth knowing. "Buenos dias, señorita," Miguel said warmly, his natural kindness evident in his voice. "El patron is waiting for you in his study. May I offer you some breakfast first?" "Thank you kindly, sir, but I ate before I came," Sarah replied, though Jim suspected that was likely a polite fiction designed to preserve her dignity. Jim positioned himself behind his desk, trying to appear absorbed in paperwork when Miguel knocked and announced Sarah's arrival. She entered with careful steps, taking in the room with wide eyes that missed nothing. The books, the maps, the comfortable furniture that probably cost more than her grandmother earned in a year. "Good morning, Mr. Crawford," she said, offering a small curtsy that managed to be respectful without being servile. "I'm ready to help with your correspondence, sir." "Good morning, Sarah. Please have a seat." Jim gestured to a chair he'd positioned near his desk, close enough for easy conversation, but not so close as to seem presumptuous. "I hope the walk wasn't too difficult." "Oh, no, sir. I enjoy walking, and the morning was pleasant." She settled into the chair with careful posture, placing her small bundle on her lap. Grandmother always says, fresh air and exercise are better medicine than anything from a bottle. As she spoke, Jim got his first clear look at what she'd been carrying. A small doll made from corn husks, twisted and tied with string to form a crude but recognizable human shape. The doll's dress was a scrap of the same blue fabric as Sarah's. Ribbon and tiny stitches in black thread suggested features on the face. "That's a lovely doll," Jim said gently, recognizing it as probably Sarah's only toy, crafted from materials that cost nothing and imagination that was priceless. Sarah's cheeks pinked slightly, but she didn't hide the doll in embarrassment. "Thank you, sir. Her name is Clara after my mama. Grandmother made her for me when I was very small." She paused, then added with the matter-of-fact honesty that seemed to characterize all her statements, "I know I'm probably too old for dolls, but she's good company when things get lonely." The simple admission hit Jim with unexpected force. Here was his daughter, clutching a corn-husk doll named for the mother she'd never known, finding comfort in a toy made from scraps because there had never been money for anything better. And contrast between her circumstances and the comfortable childhood he could have provided was almost unbearable. "I think," Jim said carefully, "that everyone needs good company, regardless of age, and anything that reminds us of the people we love is worth treasuring." Sarah's face brightened with relief, and something that might have been gratitude for his understanding. She carefully placed the doll on the edge of his desk where she could see it while they worked. "Now then," Jim said, opening a drawer and pulling out a stack of genuine correspondence that had been accumulating for weeks. "I do have some real organizing to do, if you're willing to help. These are letters from cattle buyers, banks, and suppliers. They need to be sorted by type and date, and some of the older ones need to be copied into a ledger for my records." Sarah's eyes lit up with the particular pleasure of someone given meaningful work rather than busy tasks. "I'd be happy to help. So should I sort them by business type first, or by the dates they were received?" "Business type first, I think. Then by date within each category." Jim pulled out paper, ink, and pens, setting them within her reach. "Your handwriting is better than mine. So if you could copy the important details into this ledger, it would be a great help. For the next 2 hours, they worked in comfortable companionship. Sarah approached each task with careful attention to detail, asking intelligent questions about business terminology she didn't recognize and organizing the papers with an efficiency that impressed Jim considerably. Her handwriting was indeed excellent, clear, consistent, and aesthetically pleasing in a way that suggested natural artistic ability. During a brief break for water and some cookies that Miguel had tactfully provided, Sarah looked up from her work with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Crawford, may I ask you something?" "Of course." "Grandmother and I have been receiving some unexpected help lately. Food deliveries that no one ordered, and yesterday Doc Henderson said someone had paid for her medical treatment." Sarah's intelligent eyes studied Jim's face carefully. "Do you know anything about that?" Jim felt heat rise in his cheeks, but kept his expression neutral. "Cedar Ridge is a small community. People look after each other when they can." "Yes, sir. But this feels different, more personal." Sarah hesitated, then continued with the directness that seemed natural to her. "Grandmother thinks it might be someone who knew Mama, someone who feels responsible for helping us because of her." The words hit closer to the truth than Jim was prepared for. He busied himself with shuffling papers, trying to find a response that wouldn't be an outright lie, but wouldn't reveal too much either. "Your mother was well regarded in town," he said finally. "It's possible someone who appreciated her character wants to ensure her daughter is properly cared for." Sarah nodded slowly, accepting the explanation, but clearly not entirely satisfied with it. "I hope whoever it is knows how grateful we are. Grandmother cried yesterday when Doc Henderson examined her hands and said he could help with the pain. She hasn't been able to do detailed sewing in months." "I'm sure they know," Jim said quietly. As the morning wore on, Jim found himself studying Sarah's profile as she worked, noting details he'd missed before. The shape of her hands, long-fingered and graceful like Clara's, but with a thumb that bent at exactly the same angle as his own. The way she unconsciously hummed while concentrating, a habit he recognized from his own childhood. The stubborn cowlick at the crown of her head that no amount of careful braiding could completely tame, identical to one that had plagued him for 43 years, but it was more than physical resemblances that convinced him. Sarah approached. Problems with the same methodical thinking he used for business decisions. She had Clara's gentle nature, but his family's tendency toward quiet determination when facing obstacles. She was polite to everyone, but deferred to no one, possessing an innate sense of her own worth that no amount of poverty had been able to diminish. "Mr. Crawford?" Sarah's voice interrupted his observations. "I think I've found an error in this letter from the bank in Dodge City. The figures don't match what they say they're calculating." Jim looked at the letter she indicated, quickly spotting the mathematical mistake that could have cost him several $100s if left uncorrected. "Well spotted. You have a good eye for numbers. Mama started teaching me arithmetic when I was very small," Sarah said proudly. "She said a woman needed to understand money and business if she wanted to survive in the world without depending on others." Clara's wisdom in preparing their daughter for independence was both admirable and heartbreaking. She'd known she wouldn't be there to protect Sarah forever, so she'd armed her with education and strength of character instead. It was exactly what Clara would have done. Practical, loving, and focused on Sarah's future rather than her own. Hardships. As noon approached, Jim found himself reluctant to send Sarah home. Having her in his house, watching her careful attention to his business affairs, seeing her unconscious gestures that reminded him of both Clara and his own family, felt more right than anything had in years. For the first time since he'd built the ranch house, it felt like a home rather than just an impressive building. "I think that's enough for today," he said finally, though the organized papers on his desk proved she'd accomplished far more than he'd expected. "You've been very helpful, Sarah. Would you be willing to come back next week? I have more correspondence that could use your attention." "Oh, yes, sir. I've enjoyed the work very much." Sarah carefully cleaned the pen she'd been using and arranged the remaining papers in neat stacks. Should I come at the same time? That would be perfect. Jim pulled out his wallet and counted out $2. More than fair payment for the work she'd done, but not so much as to seem suspicious. For your excellent assistance. Sarah accepted the money with the same dignity she'd shown before, folding it carefully and tucking it into her dress pocket. Thank you, Mr. Crawford. Grandmother will be so pleased. As she prepared to leave, Sarah carefully picked up her corn-husk doll, smoothing its simple dress with gentle fingers. The gesture was so tender, so full of the kind of love that transformed the humblest object into treasure, that Jim felt his throat tighten with emotion. Sarah, he said impulsively, would you like me to have someone drive you home? It's getting warm for such a long walk. That's very kind, sir, but I enjoy the exercise. And besides, she added with a small smile, Clara and I have good conversations on our walks. She's an excellent listener. After Sarah left, Jim sat in his study, staring at the work she'd completed. Her handwriting filled page after page of his ledger, each entry precise and clear. More than that, though, her presence had filled his house with something it had been missing for 20 years, the sense that it mattered to someone other than himself. That evening, as he shared dinner with Miguel's family in the comfortable kitchen behind the main house, Jim found himself thinking about corn-husk dolls and blue ribbons, about a little girl who walked 6 miles to earn $2, and about the woman who had raised that girl to find dignity in honest work and comfort in simple things. His daughter was growing up brave and kind and strong, despite every disadvantage circumstances had placed in her path. Clara's influence lived on in every word Sarah spoke, every gesture she made, every choice she made to meet hardship with grace rather than bitterness. But Clara's influence alone hadn't been enough to keep Sarah from going hungry, to keep Ruth from hiding her pain because medical care was too expensive, to keep his daughter from facing an uncertain future with only a corn-husk doll for comfort. That night, Jim made arrangements with Morrison's store for weekly food deliveries to the Washington house. He set up an account with Doc Henderson to cover all of Ruth's medical needs, and he began to plan ways to ensure Sarah's education would continue, her future would be secure, and she would never again have to whisper to a stranger that she was too poor to eat. He couldn't undo the past, but he could make sure the future held better promises for the daughter he was finally ready to claim. 2 weeks after Sarah's first visit to the ranch, Jim received an urgent message from Doc Henderson. Ruth Washington had collapsed during Sunday service and was now bedridden, with what appeared to be a severe flare-up of her arthritis, complicated by exhaustion and malnutrition. The doctor's note was brief but pointed. She needs rest, proper medication, and better food. Without intervention, I fear for her condition. Jim arrived in town within the hour, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. If Ruth's health failed completely, Sarah would be truly orphaned, dependent on the charity of a community that was already struggling to care for its own. Worse, there was talk. He'd heard the whispers at Morrison's store of sending her to distant relatives in Louisiana who might provide basic care, but would never understand the remarkable child they'd be inheriting. Doc Henderson met him at the clinic with tired eyes and grave expression. She's stable for now, but Jim, that woman has been living on pride and determination for months. Her body finally gave out on her. What does she need? Complete rest for at least 2 weeks, medication that's expensive but necessary, and proper nutrition to help her body heal. Henderson paused meaningfully. I took the liberty of starting treatment immediately, knowing you'd want the bills sent to your body heal. Henderson paused meaningfully. I took the liberty of starting treatment immediately, knowing you'd want the bills sent to you. Of course, whatever she needs. Jim pulled out his wallet, but Henderson waved it away. Already taken care of through your account. But Jim, the doctor's expression grew concerned. People are starting to notice the pattern. Food deliveries, medical bills, other assistance appearing whenever the Washington family needs help. Ruth's not a fool, and neither are the folks in town. That afternoon, Jim made his way to the small house at the edge of Cedar Ridge, where Ruth and Sarah lived. It was a modest structure, probably built originally as a worker's cottage for one of the larger ranches, but it was clean and well-maintained despite its obvious age. A small garden behind the house showed signs of careful tending, though many of the plants looked stressed from the recent lack of attention. Sarah answered his knock, her face lighting up with surprised pleasure before quickly shifting to concern. "Mr. Crawford, is everything all right? I thought we weren't supposed to work together again until next Tuesday. I heard your grandmother was unwell. I wanted to check on you both, see if there was anything I could do to help." Sarah's composure, so steady throughout their previous interactions, finally cracked slightly. "Oh, Mr. Crawford, I'm so worried about her. She's been trying to hide how bad the pain has gotten, but yesterday she could barely move her fingers. And this morning she couldn't get out of bed at all. May I see her?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment. Proper etiquette suggested that unmarried women shouldn't receive male visitors without supervision, but concern for her grandmother overrode. "Social conventions. Please, yes. She's been asking about who's been helping us. Maybe you can convince her to stop worrying about that and focus on getting better." The interior of the house was as neat and clean as its exterior, but the poverty was evident in every detail. Furniture that had been carefully repaired multiple times, clothing hung on pegs because there was no wardrobe, dishes that didn't match but were spotlessly maintained. Yet there were also signs of love and learning. Books stacked carefully on a makeshift shelf, Sarah's schoolwork displayed with pride, and wildflowers in a cracked vase that brought color to the simple room. Ruth Washington was propped up in a narrow bed, her dark skin pale with illness and her hands wrapped in soft bandages. But her eyes were alert and intelligent, studying Jim with an intensity that made him feel exposed and vulnerable. "Mr. Crawford," she said, her voice weak but still carrying authority. "How kind of you to visit. Sarah, fetch our guest some water and give us a few minutes to talk." Sarah looked between them with obvious curiosity, but she obeyed without question. When the door closed behind her, Ruth's gaze never left Jim's face. "Sit down, please. My neck hurts from looking up at you." Jim pulled a wooden chair close to the bed, noting how Ruth watched his every movement with the sharp attention of someone accustomed to reading people's true intentions beneath their polite words. "I suppose you're wondering why I asked to speak privately," Ruth said. "I assumed you wanted to discuss Sarah's future, given your illness." "That's part of it." Ruth's fingers worked restlessly at the edge of her blanket, the movement obviously painful but seemingly involuntary. "Mr. Crawford, I may be old and sick, but I'm not blind or stupid. Someone has been taking very personal care of my granddaughter and me, and that someone knows things about our needs that strangers wouldn't know." Jim felt his pulse quicken, but he kept his expression neutral. "Cedar Ridge is a close community." "Don't." Ruth's voice carried surprising strength. "Don't insult my intelligence with platitudes about community spirit. The person helping us knows that Sarah's birthday is next month because the food deliveries included ingredients for a cake. They know I take my medicine better with honey than water because honey appears in every delivery. They know Sarah's favorite color is blue because the last package included blue hair ribbons." Each observation hit Jim like a small revelation. He'd been trying so hard to help anonymously that he'd unconsciously revealed intimate knowledge that only someone close to the family should possess. "More than that," Ruth continued, her eyes never leaving his face, "they know things about Clara. The medicine you've been sending includes a specific tea blend, expensive, from back east, that Clara used to drink when she was expecting Sarah. The only person who would remember that detail is someone who cared about Clara very much." Jim felt the careful walls he'd built around his secret beginning to crumble. Ruth's intelligence and determination reminded him powerfully of Clara, and he realized he was facing the same directness that had first attracted him to her daughter. "Mrs. Washington." Ruth If we're going to have an honest conversation, we might as well use honest names." She paused, gathering strength for what came next. "I know who you are, James Crawford. Clara told me about you." The words hit him like a physical blow. He'd expected suspicion, perhaps accusations, but not this calm certainty that stripped away all his carefully maintained pretenses. "What did she tell you?" "That she loved a man who was good and kind, but trapped by circumstances beyond his control. That she understood why he couldn't choose her, and that she forgave him for it." Ruth's voice softened slightly. "She also told me that if anything ever happened to her, I should contact you if Sarah needed help." Jim stared at her, his mind reeling. "But you didn't. She died 8 years ago, and you never—" "Clara made me promise I wouldn't. Unless Sarah was in real danger. She said you'd already sacrificed enough for duty and family expectations, and she wouldn't burden you with more obligations." Ruth's expression grew sad. "But she also made me promise to tell Sarah the truth about her father, when she was old enough to understand, and to give her this when that came." Ruth reached under her pillow with obvious difficulty and pulled out a small object wrapped in soft cloth. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped it to reveal a silver pocket watch, beautifully crafted and clearly expensive. Jim's breath. It caught in his throat. He recognized the watch immediately. It had belonged to his father, and before that to his grandfather. He'd given it to Clara during their courtship, a token of his serious intentions, and a promise of the future he'd hoped they would share. When he'd ended their relationship, she'd tried to return it, but he'd been too ashamed to take it back, telling her to keep it as a reminder of the good times they'd shared. "Clara saved this for Sarah," Ruth said, holding the watch carefully in her bandaged hands. "She said it belonged to her father's family, and someday Sarah should know where she came from." Jim reached out with shaking hands to take the watch, its familiar weight bringing back a flood of memories. Inside the cover, he knew, was an inscription: "To James, with love and hope for all our tomorrows. Clara." "She knew," he whispered. "Of course she knew. Clara was many things, but naive wasn't one of them." Ruth's voice held a mixture of sadness and gentle rebuke. "She knew about the family pressure you were under, knew about the expectations and obligations that came with your name and position. She also knew you loved her enough to have chosen differently if you could have." "Then why didn't she tell me?" "About Sarah, I could have..." "Could have what?" "Abandoned your responsibilities and thrown away everything your family built. Faced social ostracism and financial ruin for the sake of a woman who was already dying." Ruth's eyes held no accusation, only tired understanding. "Clara was smarter than that, and kinder. She loved you too much to destroy your life with obligations you couldn't fulfill." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Sarah entered with a glass of water and a small plate of cookies, her eyes immediately going to the watch in Jim's hands. "Grandmother, isn't that—" "Yes, child. It's time for you to know where this came from." Ruth gestured for Sarah to sit on the edge of the bed. "Sarah, this watch belonged to your father. He gave it to your mother when they were courting, and she saved it for you." Sarah's eyes widened as she looked between the watch and Jim's face, understanding dawning with the quick intelligence that characterized everything about her. "My father? Mr. Crawford is your father, Sarah. He didn't know about you when your mother died, but he's been taking care of us these past weeks because he's learned the truth." For a long moment the small room was silent, except for the sound of Jim's ragged breathing and the distant noise of the town going about its daily business. Sarah stared at him with eyes that were so much like Clara's, it made his chest ache, while Ruth watched them both with the careful attention of someone who understood the magnitude of the moment. "Is it true?" Sarah asked finally, her voice very small. Jim looked into his daughter's face and knew that the time for half-truths and careful deceptions was over. Clara had forgiven him his cowardice once. He wouldn't compound it by lying to their child. "Yes," he said simply. "It's true. I'm your father, And I'm sorry it took me so long to find the courage to tell you. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, filling every corner of the small room with its implications. Sarah continued to stare at Jim with eyes that seemed to be trying to reconcile the wealthy rancher she'd known for weeks with the father she'd never imagined. Her small hands clutched the silver watch as if it were an anchor in suddenly turbulent waters. "But why?" Sarah began, then stopped, her young mind wrestling with questions too complex for easy answers. Ruth struggled to sit up straighter in bed, wincing with the effort, but determined to maintain her dignity during this crucial conversation. "Sarah, child, come here to me." Sarah moved to sit closer to her grandmother, never taking her eyes off Jim's face. The family resemblance was unmistakable now that the truth was in the open. The same determined jawline, the same intelligent eyes, the same way of holding themselves with unconscious pride, even in difficult moments. "There's more you need to know," Ruth said, her voice growing weaker but more urgent. "About your mother, and about the choice she made." She looked at Jim with an expression that mixed compassion with challenge. "And there are things your father needs to understand about the woman he loved." Jim leaned forward in his chair, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What things?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment, gathering both strength and courage for what she was about to reveal. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of secrets that had been carefully guarded for 8 years. "Clara knew she was dying long before. You came back from your business trip to Colorado, Mr. Crawford. The difficult birth, the complications. Doc Henderson told her privately that her heart had been damaged, that she probably had months, not years." The words hit Jim like a physical blow. He'd been away for 3 weeks when Sarah was born, dealing with a cattle purchase that had seemed monumentally important at the time. By the time he'd returned, Clara was already buried, and the talk was that she'd died suddenly of complications from childbirth. "She knew she was dying, and she chose not to tell you," Ruth continued, her eyes holding steady on Jim's face. "She made me promise to keep her secret until Sarah was old enough to understand the full truth." "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice small and confused. "If Papa was here and Mama was dying, why didn't she tell him about me?" Ruth reached out with trembling hands to touch Sarah's face, her expression infinitely tender. "Because your Mama loved your Papa enough to protect him from an impossible choice, even when it meant facing death alone." She turned to Jim, her eyes now holding a different quality, the look of someone about to deliver news that would change everything. "James Crawford, Clara knew about your father's ultimatum. She knew he'd threatened to disown you if you married her. She also knew about the debts the ranch was carrying, the loans that would come due if you lost your inheritance." Jim's world tilted sideways. "She knew about the debts? But I never told anyone." "Clara wasn't just a seamstress, Mr. Crawford. She was an educated woman from a good family in Louisiana who'd come west to escape her own family's financial troubles. She understood business, and she understood men. Like your father." Ruth's voice grew softer. "She also understood that a man faced with choosing between love and duty might make a choice that would destroy him with guilt for the rest of his life." The room seemed to be spinning around Jim as implications crashed over him like successive waves. Clara had known about his family's financial situation, had understood the impossible position he'd been in, and had chosen to release him from it without his knowledge. "There's something else," Ruth said, reaching under her pillow again. This time she withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed with age and handled with obvious care. "Clara wrote you a letter before she died. She made me promise to give it to you only if you ever learned about Sarah and came looking for answers." Jim's hand shook as he took the envelope. His name was written on the front in Clara's careful script, along with the words, "To be opened only in the presence of our daughter." The seal. "Read it aloud," Ruth said quietly. "Sarah needs to hear her mother's words, and you need to understand the sacrifice she made." With trembling fingers, Jim broke the seal and unfolded 2 pages of paper covered in Clara's handwriting. He recognized the paper as matching some he'd seen in her house years ago, good quality stock that she'd probably saved for important occasions. His throat felt tight as he began to read. "My dearest James," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you are reading this letter, it means our daughter has found her way to you, and you have found the courage to claim her. I pray that day comes, though I will not live to see it. By the time you read these words, I will have been gone for years, and Sarah will be old enough to understand that life sometimes requires sacrifices that seem impossible to make. I write this now, while she sleeps peacefully in my arms, to explain the choice I made and to ask for your forgiveness." Jim's voice broke slightly, and he had to pause to collect himself. Sarah reached out and touched his arm, a gesture of comfort that nearly undid him completely. "I know about your father's ultimatum," Jim continued reading. "I know he threatened to disown you if you chose me over duty. And I know about the financial obligations that would crush you if you lost your inheritance. More than that, I know the kind of man you are, honorable, responsible, incapable of abandoning your obligations, even when they break your heart. I also know I am dying. Doc Henderson thinks I don't understand the medical terms he uses, but I was raised by a father who was a physician, and I recognize the signs he's too kind to speak directly. My heart is failing, and I have perhaps months to live. If I told you about our daughter, you would face an impossible choice: abandon your family's ranch and legacy to marry a dying woman, or live with the knowledge that you had a child you couldn't acknowledge. Either choice would destroy the good man I fell in love with." Jim had to stop reading as tears blurred his vision. Sarah had moved closer to him, her small hand resting on his arm in silent support, while Ruth watched with eyes that held both sadness and a strange peace. "So I choose for both of us," Jim continued, his voice steadier now. "I choose to give you your freedom, while giving our daughter your name in my heart, if not in law. I choose to let you remember our love as something beautiful, rather than something that destroyed your life. I choose to raise Sarah with stories of her father's goodness, so she will understand that she comes from strength and honor, even if circumstances have kept you apart. I have asked Ruth to keep this secret until Sarah is old enough to understand that love sometimes means letting go. When that time comes, I hope you will be the father I know you can be, not from obligation or guilt, but from the same love that gave us this precious child. Our daughter has your intelligence and your stubborn determination, but I hope she has inherited my ability to forgive what seems unforgivable. If you are reading this letter, it means you have overcome whatever fear or shame kept you from acknowledging her. That courage alone proves you are worthy of her love. Do not carry guilt for the choice I made, my darling. I made it freely, with full knowledge of what I was giving up and what I was protecting. The months I have left with Sarah will be filled with love, not regret. I will tell her stories of her father's kindness, his strength, his dedication to doing what he believes is right. When she is older and you are part of her life, she will understand that true love sometimes requires the hardest choices of all. Take care of our daughter, James. Love her as we both loved you, completely, unconditionally, with the kind of devotion that transforms ordinary moments into miracles. Give her the life I cannot, the security I cannot provide, the future I will not live to see. And please, if you can find it in your heart, forgive a woman who loved you too much to burden you with an impossible choice. All my love, always and forever, Clara. The letter ended with a postscript written in different ink, clearly added. Later, Sarah Elizabeth Crawford, born June 15, 1867. She has your eyes and my stubborn streak. She will be extraordinary. Silence filled the room as Jim folded the letter with trembling hands. Sarah was crying quietly, tears streaming down her cheeks as she absorbed the magnitude of her mother's sacrifice. Ruth lay back against her pillows, looking simultaneously exhausted and relieved, as if a burden she'd carried for years had finally been lifted. She protected both of you, Ruth said quietly. She protected you from an impossible choice, and she protected Sarah from growing up believing her father didn't want her. Jim looked at his daughter. He could think of her no other way now, and saw Clara's generosity of spirit reflected in the young face. Even learning that her mother had died to protect others, Sarah's expression held no bitterness, only a deep sadness mixed with something that might have been pride. "Papa," Sarah said, using the word tentatively, as if testing how it felt. "Mama was very brave, wasn't she?" "The bravest woman I ever knew," Jim said, his voice rough with emotion. "And so are you." For the first time in 8 years, James Crawford understood the true cost of the choice Clara had made. She hadn't just died alone. She'd lived alone, raised their daughter alone, faced poverty and hardship alone, all to spare him the burden of an obligation that might have destroyed his life. But she'd also given him something precious beyond measure, the chance to choose his daughter freely, from love rather than duty, when he was finally strong enough and wise enough to be the father she deserved. The question now was whether he had the courage to prove worthy of Clara's faith in him and Sarah's trust in the father she was just beginning to know. Ruth Washington passed away peacefully 3 days later, with Sarah holding one of her hands and Jim holding the other. Doc Henderson said it was as gentle a death as he'd ever witnessed. She simply closed her eyes during an afternoon nap and didn't wake up. Her face serene and untroubled. Her last words had been to Sarah. "Remember that you are loved, child. Remember that you come from good people who made hard choices with courage." The funeral was held on a crisp October morning with half the town in attendance. Ruth had been more respected than Jim had realized, her quiet dignity and kindness having touched more lives than she'd probably known. Sarah stood beside Jim throughout the service, dry-eyed but pale, her small hand occasionally finding his for comfort. As the mourners dispersed, Jim noticed the whispered conversations, the speculative glances directed at him and Sarah. Word had spread about his presence at Ruth's bedside, about the mysterious benefactor who had been caring for the Washington family, about the striking resemblance between the wealthy rancher and the newly orphaned child. Cedar Ridge was too small a community for such secrets to remain hidden for long. "Mr. Crawford," Judge Morrison approached as the last of the mourners were leaving the cemetery. He was a stern man in his 60s, respected for his fairness, but known for his adherence to social conventions. "Might I have a word with you privately?" Jim looked down at Sarah, who was standing quietly beside Clara's grave, her corn-husk doll clutched tightly in her arms. "Sarah, would you mind waiting by the buggy for a few minutes? I need to speak with Judge Morrison." She nodded solemnly and walked away, her small figure looking impossibly vulnerable in her black dress, the only formal clothing she owned, purchased for the occasion by Jim, but tasteful enough not to draw attention to its newness. "Jim, Judge you," Morrison began, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "There's been considerable talk about the child's future. Ruth Washington had a cousin in Louisiana who's willing to take her in. The woman runs a boarding house and could provide Sarah with basic care and some education." "I see." Jim kept his voice carefully neutral, though his heart was racing. "And you think that would be best for Sarah?" "I think it would be appropriate," Morrison replied, emphasizing the last word meaningfully. "The child needs stability, proper supervision, and an environment suitable for a young lady of her circumstances." The coded language wasn't lost on Jim. Morrison was diplomatically suggesting that a mixed-race child would face fewer challenges in Louisiana, where such circumstances were more common, than she would growing up in a frontier town, where she might always be viewed as different. "What if there were another option?" Jim asked carefully. Morrison's eyes sharpened with interest and something that might have been concern. "What sort of option?" "What if someone local wanted to take responsibility for her? Someone with the means to provide proper education, security, and opportunity for advancement. That would depend entirely on who was making such an offer and their motivations for doing so." Morrison paused. studying Jim's face with the practiced eye of a man who had spent decades evaluating the truth behind people's stated intentions. "Jim, I've known you for 15 years. You're a good man, generous with your community and fair in your business dealings. But taking in an orphaned child is a serious commitment, especially when what, Judge?" Morrison sighed, the sound of a man who had delivered difficult truths before and found no pleasure in the task. "Especially when there are already questions about your relationship to the child. People have eyes, Jim. They can see the resemblance, and they remember who used to visit Clara Washington before she died. If you formally take custody of Sarah, you'll be confirming suspicions that some folks would prefer to remain unspoken." The implications hung in the air between them like a challenge. Jim understood what Morrison was really saying. Acknowledging Sarah publicly would mean acknowledging his relationship with Clara, subjecting both himself and his daughter to scrutiny and potential social ostracism. "And if I don't take responsibility for her?" Jim asked. "Then she goes to Louisiana, where she can start fresh with people who don't know her history. It might be kinder in the long run." Jim looked toward the buggy where Sarah waited patiently, her small figure outlined against the autumn sky. She was reading a book, one of the few possessions she'd salvaged from the house that would soon belong to new tenants. Completely absorbed, despite the emotional turmoil of the day. Watching her, Jim felt the same fierce protectiveness he'd experienced the first day he'd truly seen her face. "I need some time to consider the options," Jim said finally. "Of course. But Jim," Morrison's voice softened slightly, "whatever you decide, make sure you're thinking about what's best for the child, not what might ease your own conscience." That evening, Jim sat in his study with legal documents spread across his desk. He'd sent for Harold Wentworth, the territorial lawyer who handled complex estate and custody matters, and the man had arrived within hours with a leather satchel full of papers and procedures. "The process is straightforward enough," Wentworth explained, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed the documents. "As an unmarried adult male with sufficient means and no criminal record, you're eligible to petition for guardianship. The judge will need to be satisfied that your motivations are appropriate and that you can provide suitable care." "What kind of questions will they ask?" "About your relationship to the child, your reasons for seeking custody, your plans for her education and upbringing." Wentworth paused meaningfully. "They'll also ask about any potential conflicts of interest or improper motivations." Jim understood the subtext. If he admitted to being Sarah's father, questions would arise about why he'd abandoned his responsibilities for 8 years. If he claimed to be merely a charitable benefactor, suspicions would arise about his true motivations for taking in a young girl. "There is another option," Wentworth said carefully. "Adult adoption. It's less common, but it would give the child your name and full legal rights as your heir. However, it would also require acknowledgement of the parental relationship and open you to potential legal challenges from other family members." Jim thought of his sister Margaret in St. Louis, who had 3 children of her own and clear opinions about family bloodlines and social propriety. She'd been pressuring him to marry suitably and produce legitimate heirs for years. Learning about Sarah would likely provoke a legal challenge to his will and a fight over the ranch's future. "I need to speak with Sarah first," Jim said finally. "This decision affects her more than anyone else." The next morning, Jim asked Sarah to join him for a ride around the ranch. She'd been staying at the hotel since Ruth's death with Mrs. Patterson, providing proper chaperoning, but the arrangement was clearly temporary. Soon decisions would have to be made about her permanent situation. They rode in comfortable silence for a while. Sarah mounted on Buttercup, the gentlest mare in Jim's stable. She was a natural horsewoman, fearless but sensible, adapting to the side saddle with the same grace she brought to everything else. "Sarah," Jim said finally, "we need to talk about your future." She turned in her saddle to look at him directly, her expression serious but unafraid. "Are you going to send me to Louisiana?" The question was asked without accusation or pleading, simply a child's need to understand her circumstances so she could prepare for whatever came next. "That depends partly on what you want," Jim said. "If you stayed here with me, it would mean some significant changes for both of us. People would ask questions, make assumptions, perhaps say unkind things. About you being my father, yes, and about your mother and me, about choices we made years ago." Jim guided Thunder closer to Buttercup so he could see Sarah's face clearly. "I need you to understand that claiming you publicly won't be easy for either of us. Some people will disapprove, some will gossip, some will treat us differently." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her intelligent eyes studying the landscape around them, the rolling hills dotted with cattle, the ranch buildings in the distance, the big sky that stretched endlessly overhead. "Papa," she said finally, using the word with growing confidence, "Grandmother always taught me that doing right wasn't the same as doing easy. She said the important choices in life usually require courage." The simple wisdom in her words, so reminiscent of both Clara and Ruth, made Jim's chest tighten with emotion. Here was his 8-year-old daughter, facing the possibility of uprooting her entire life, showing more courage than he'd demonstrated in years. "If I stayed with you," Sarah continued, "could I still visit Mama's and Grandmother's graves? Could I keep learning and maybe help with the ranch work? Could I still be myself, or would I have to pretend to be someone different?" "You could be exactly who you are," Jim said firmly. "That's not negotiable." Sarah smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since Ruth's death. "Then I'd like to stay if you'll have me. Mama always said family was about love and choice, not just blood. If you're willing to choose me, I'm willing to choose you too." That afternoon, Jim returned to Judge Morrison's office with Sarah at his side and the adoption papers in his coat pocket. The judge listened gravely as Jim formally requested custody, asking the expected questions about motivations and capabilities. "And you understand the implications of this decision?" Morrison asked, his gaze moving between Jim and Sarah. "I understand that I'm claiming my daughter," Jim said clearly, his voice carrying throughout the small office. "I understand that means acknowledging my relationship with her mother, accepting responsibility I should have taken years ago, and committing to provide Sarah with everything she needs to build the life she deserves." Morrison nodded slowly, then turned to Sarah. "Young lady, do you understand what Mr. Crawford is proposing? He would become your legal guardian, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady and clear. "He would become my father-in-law, like he's already my father in truth." "And you're comfortable with this arrangement?" "Yes, sir. Very comfortable." Morrison signed the preliminary papers. With deliberate care, each stroke of his pen carrying legal weight that would reshape both their lives. As they left the courthouse, Sarah slipped her hand into Jim's with natural ease. "Papa, what happens now?" Jim looked down at his daughter, his officially acknowledged daughter, and felt something settle into place in his chest that had been missing for years. "Now we go home," he said, "and we figure out how to be a family." That evening, as Jim helped Sarah settle into the bedroom that had been hastily prepared for her at the ranch, she pulled out her corn-husk doll and set it carefully on the nightstand. "Papa," she said as he tucked her into bed, "do you think Mama and Grandmother would be happy about today?" Jim thought of Clara's letter, of her hope that he would someday find the courage to be the father she'd believed he could become. He thought of Ruth's quiet dignity and her faith that truth would eventually prevail over fear. "I think," he said, kissing Sarah's forehead gently, "they would be very proud of both of us." Outside, the wind carried the scent of autumn across the prairie, promising changes ahead, but also the enduring strength of land and sky and the people who chose to make their lives beneath the endless horizon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, James Crawford's house was finally a home. The first photograph of Jim and Sarah together was taken on Christmas morning, 6 weeks after she'd come to live at the Broken Arrow Ranch. They stood, On the wide front porch, Sarah wearing a new blue dress that brought out her eyes, Jim's hand resting protectively on her shoulder. The traveling photographer who'd been hired for the occasion captured something precious in that moment, the careful joy of two people learning to be a family. Sarah had insisted on having her cornhusk doll, Clara, in the photograph as well. "She's part of our family too," she'd explained with the matter-of-fact logic that characterized all her statements. "She connects us to Mama and Grandmother." The weeks since the adoption had been a period of cautious discovery for both of them. Sarah approached her new life with the same methodical intelligence she brought to everything else, exploring the ranch house room by room, learning the rhythms of cattle ranch life, and gradually relaxing into the security of knowing she belonged somewhere permanently. Jim, meanwhile, found himself navigating the unfamiliar territory of fatherhood with a mixture of determination and terror. He'd never realized how many decisions were involved in raising a child. What time should she go to bed? What subjects should she study? How much independence was appropriate for an 8-year-old girl growing up on a working ranch? "Papa," Sarah said one morning over breakfast, using the word with increasing confidence, "Mrs. Patterson asked me yesterday if you were planning to send me to a fancy school back east, like some of the other wealthy families do." Jim looked up from his coffee, noting the careful neutrality in Sarah's voice. She'd learned to present questions without revealing her own preferences, a habit that probably came from years of knowing that her desires might not align with what circumstances could provide. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that you and I hadn't discussed it yet, but that I hoped I could stay here and keep learning about the ranch." Sarah paused, then added with characteristic honesty, "I also told her that I thought families should stay together when they could." The simple statement hit Jim with unexpected force. After years of living alone, he'd forgotten how much he valued having someone to share meals with, someone who cared about his day and his plans. Sarah brought life to the big house in ways he hadn't anticipated. Her books on the library tables, her careful handwriting in the ledgers where she helped with correspondence, her laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long. "I think you're right about families staying together," Jim said. "We'll arrange for tutors to supplement your regular schooling. Maybe bring in a music teacher if you're interested. There's no reason you can't get an excellent education, right?" "Here." Sarah's face lit up with relief and pleasure. "Could I learn about ranch management too? I know it's not traditional for girls, but I'd like to understand how everything works. I'd be honored to teach you." Jim found himself smiling at her enthusiasm. "In fact, I was hoping you might want to take on some responsibilities around here. Nothing too demanding but meaningful work that contributes to the ranch's success." They were interrupted by a knock at the front door, followed by Miguel's voice calling that they had visitors. Jim frowned. It was early for business calls, and he wasn't expecting anyone from town. When they reached the front hall, Jim found himself facing his sister, Margaret, and her husband, Robert Thornton, along with a man he didn't recognize wearing the kind of expensive suit that suggested legal profession. "Hello, James," Margaret said, her voice carrying the particular chill she reserved for occasions when she strongly disapproved of someone's behavior. "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit. We were in the area on business and thought it was time to meet your ward." The pause before the last word suggested Margaret had chosen it deliberately, avoiding the more accurate term of daughter that might acknowledge what she clearly preferred to ignore. "Margaret, Robert." Jim nodded politely to his sister and brother-in-law, then looked expectantly at their companion. "And you are?" "Harrison Blackwood, attorney," the man said, extending a business card. "I represent your sister's interests in matters of family estate planning." Jim felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. Margaret had clearly come prepared for a confrontation, bringing legal representation to what should have been a family visit. "Sarah," Jim said quietly, "why don't you go find Miguel and ask him to show you the new foals in the stable? I need to speak with my sister privately." Sarah looked between the adults with the sharp intelligence that missed nothing, clearly recognizing tension, even if she didn't understand its source. "Yes, Papa. Should I ask Maria to prepare refreshments for your guests? That would be thoughtful. Thank you." After Sarah left, Margaret wasted no time getting to the point of her visit. "James, what exactly do you think you're doing?" "I'm raising my daughter. I thought that was fairly obvious." "Your alleged daughter," Blackwood corrected smoothly. "A claim that lacks legal documentation and raises serious questions about your mental competency." Jim felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Getting defensive would only make Margaret feel justified in whatever action she was planning. "My competency isn't in question. I've legally adopted Sarah through proper channels with judicial approval and full documentation." "Adoption based on fraudulent claims," Margaret snapped. "James, you can't seriously expect anyone to believe you've suddenly discovered a daughter you never knew existed. The whole situation reeks of either deception or delusion." "Actually," Robert interjected in his measured accountant's voice, "what concerns us is the impact this will have on the family's financial interests. The Broken Arrow Ranch represents significant assets that have been in the Crawford family for 3 generations. Now Jim understood. This wasn't about Sarah's welfare, or even about moral objections to his acknowledgement of her. This was about money and inheritance, about Margaret's concerns that her own children's future prosperity might be threatened by the sudden appearance of another heir. "Are you challenging my right to determine the disposition of my own property?" Jim asked quietly. "We're questioning whether you're making rational decisions," Blackwood replied. "Taking in a child of questionable parentage, making impulsive legal commitments, dramatically altering your estate planning. These behaviors suggest someone who may not be thinking clearly." "I've never thought more clearly in my life." Margaret's expression softened slightly, taking on the concerned tone she'd perfected over years of managing family dynamics. "James, I understand that you're lonely. I understand that you might feel guilty about some past relationship, but ruining your reputation and potentially your financial future isn't the answer. What are you proposing?" "The child should be sent to a good school in the East, somewhere she can receive proper education and preparation for a suitable life. You can fund her education generously without formally acknowledging paternity or making her your heir." The cold calculation behind the suggestion made Jim's stomach turn. Margaret was proposing to solve the problem of Sarah by essentially buying her off, providing education and support in exchange for her disappearing from the family permanently. "And if I refuse?" Blackwood stepped forward, his expression professionally neutral. "Then we would be forced to petition the court for a competency hearing. Your recent erratic behavior, combined with questionable judgment regarding family finances, might warrant judicial oversight of your affairs." The threat was clear. Abandon Sarah or face a legal challenge that could result in losing control of the ranch entirely. Margaret had always been ruthless when family interests were at stake, but Jim hadn't expected her to go this far. "I need time to consider your proposal," Jim said finally. "Of course. But James," Margaret's voice carried genuine concern now, mixed with her usual determination to get her way. "Think carefully about what you're risking. The Crawford name means something in this territory. Don't throw that away for a moment." Of misguided sentiment. After they left, Jim stood alone in his study, staring out at the winter landscape that stretched endlessly beyond his property lines. In the distance, he could see Sarah with Miguel, examining the new foals with the careful attention she brought to everything that interested her. She belonged here, he realized, not just because she was his daughter, but because she understood the land and the work and the values that had built the Broken Arrow Ranch. She had the intelligence to learn the business, the character to handle responsibility, and the strength to carry on the family legacy in ways that Margaret's children, raised in urban comfort, never could. The question was whether he had the courage to fight for her, knowing that the battle might cost him everything his family had built over 3 generations. That evening, Jim called Sarah into his study after dinner. She entered with her usual careful composure, though he could see questions in her eyes about the earlier visit from his sister. Sarah had inherited Clara's ability to sense undercurrents in adult conversations, even when the specific details were beyond her understanding. "Papa, is everything all right?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk with her corn-husk doll in her lap. "You've seemed worried since your sister left." Jim studied his daughter's face, noting again the intelligence that shone in her dark eyes, the quiet strength that had carried her through loss and uncertainty, the innate dignity that no amount of hardship had been able to touch. In 8 weeks, she'd become as essential to his daily life as breathing. Yet Margaret's visit had made him realize how fragile their newfound family still was. "Sarah, I need to tell you about some decisions we might have to make." Jim kept his voice gentle but honest. "My sister believes that you would be better off attending school in the East, away from here." Sarah's hands tightened slightly on her doll, but her expression remained steady. "Because she doesn't think I belong in your family." The perceptive question shouldn't have surprised him. Sarah had always been able to cut through adult euphemisms to reach uncomfortable truths. "Something like that, yes. And what do you think, Papa?" Jim leaned forward, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "I think you belong exactly where you are. I think this ranch needs someone who understands its value beyond just money and land. I think you're my daughter in every way that matters, and I'm not willing to send you away to make other people comfortable." Relief flickered across Sarah's features, though she tried to hide it. "Even if it causes problems for you?" "Especially then." Jim rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside Sarah's chair, bringing himself to her eye level. "Sarah, I made a terrible mistake 8 years ago when I let fear and other people's expectations keep me from being the father you deserved. I won't make that mistake again." Sarah reached out to touch his face with one small hand, a gesture so reminiscent of Clara that it took his breath away. "Mama always said that the people worth keeping in your life are the ones who love you for who you are, not who they want you to be. Your mother was a wise woman." Jim covered Sarah's hand with his own. "Tomorrow, I'm going to town to see Judge Morrison and Mr. Blackwood. I'm going to make it clear that you're my daughter and my heir, and that anyone who has a problem with that will have to deal with me directly." The next morning, Jim dressed in his finest suit and pinned his father's gold watch chain across his vest. If he was going to fight for his family, he would do it with all the dignity and authority his position could command. Sarah watched him, prepare with solemn attention, understanding somehow that this was a significant moment. "Papa," she said as he prepared to leave, "would you take this with you?" She held out a small object wrapped in cloth. Clara's blue ribbon, the one she'd fought to keep from Tommy Fletcher what seemed like a lifetime ago. "Why, sweetheart? Mama always said that courage comes easier when we remember the people who love us. This will remind you that Mama believed in you, and I believe in you too." Jim tucked the ribbon carefully into his vest pocket, feeling its weight like a talisman against the challenges ahead. At the courthouse, he found Margaret, Robert, and Blackwood waiting in Judge Morrison's chambers, their expressions suggesting they'd expected him to capitulate to their demands overnight. Morrison looked up from a stack of legal documents with weary resignation. "Jim, I understand your sister has some concerns about your recent decisions." "My sister has concerns about her children's inheritance," Jim corrected mildly, "which is understandable but irrelevant to my legal rights as an adult to determine my own family arrangements." Blackwood cleared his throat officiously. "Mr. Crawford, we're prepared to file for a competency hearing if necessary. Your recent behavior suggests possible mental instability." "Does it?" Jim interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had made him successful in business negotiations. "Let's examine that claim. I've legally adopted a child through proper judicial channels. I've provided her with appropriate care, education, and supervision. I've improved her living conditions dramatically while maintaining my business obligations efficiently." He paused, looking directly at each person in the room. If caring for family members constitutes mental instability, then half the territory should be declared incompetent. Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. Margaret, what specifically do you believe constitutes grounds for a competency challenge? Margaret's composed facade cracked slightly. He's acknowledged a child of questionable parentage, potentially exposing the family to scandal and financial claims. I've acknowledged my daughter, Jim said firmly. Her parentage isn't questionable. It's documented, witnessed, and legally established. As for financial claims, I have the right to leave my property to whomever I choose. James, Robert interjected, be reasonable. The child can be provided, but without making her your primary heir. Think about the Crawford family legacy. I'm thinking about it. Jim stood, his height and bearing making him seem to fill the small office. Sarah understands this land, respects its value, and has the intelligence to preserve what we've built while adapting to changing times. She's exactly the kind of person the Crawford legacy needs. Blackwood shuffled his papers with obvious frustration. This emotional attachment is clouding your judgment. No, Jim said quietly, his hand unconsciously touching Clara's ribbon in his pocket. For the first time in years, my judgment is completely clear. Sarah is my daughter. She's my heir, and she's staying with me. If you want to challenge that in court, you're welcome to try. But understand that I'll fight any such challenge with every resource at my disposal. The room fell silent as the implications of Jim's statement sank in. He was not only refusing to back down, but actively challenging them to proceed with legal action that could expose Margaret's financial motivations and potentially damage her own reputation. Judge Morrison finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of legal authority. Unless there's compelling evidence of actual incompetence or danger to the child, I see no grounds for judicial intervention in this matter. Mr. Crawford has acted within his legal rights and appears to be providing excellent care for his daughter. Margaret's face flushed with anger and frustration. James, you're making a mistake that could destroy everything our family has worked to build. No, Margaret, Jim replied, his voice gentle but implacable. I'm finally building something worth preserving. As he walked home that afternoon, the winter sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground, Jim felt lighter than he had in years. He'd chosen love over fear, family over social expectations, truth over comfortable lies, and waiting for him at home was his daughter, probably helping Maria prepare dinner while telling her about some book she'd been reading, bringing warmth and purpose to a house that had been merely impressive for far too long. For the first time since Clara's death, James Crawford's future looked exactly the way he wanted it to. 6 months later, on a warm spring morning that carried the scent of new grass and wildflowers, Jim and Sarah knelt side by side in the garden they were planting behind the ranch house. It was Sarah's idea, a memorial garden for Clara, filled with all the flowers her mother had loved. Purple wildflowers like the one Clara had given Jim during their first picnic, blue morning glories that matched her favorite ribbon, and white roses that Miguel had ordered special from a nursery in Denver. "Papa, do you think Mama can see this?" Sarah asked, her hands gently patting soil around a young rosebush. At 9 years old, she'd grown taller and stronger, her face losing some of its childhood roundness, while retaining the bright intelligence that made everything about her remarkable. "I think she can," Jim replied, watching as Sarah's careful fingers arranged the earth with the same precision she brought to everything else. "And I think she'd be proud of how beautiful you're making it." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of easy companionship that had developed between them over months of shared meals, evening conversations, and the countless small moments that built a family. Sarah had taken to ranch life with enthusiasm that sometimes amazed Jim. She could discuss cattle breeding programs with the same interest she brought to the novels she devoured, and she developed an uncanny ability to spot problems with fences, or equipment that even experienced hands sometimes missed. Mr. Crawford. They looked up to see a small figure running across the pasture toward them. Tommy Fletcher, the boy who'd once tormented Sarah about her mother's ribbon. But this Tommy was different from the bully of months past, his face bright with excitement. Rather than malice. "Sarah," he called as he got closer, "did you hear? Miss Henderson said the railroad's definitely coming through Cedar Ridge next year. They'll need supplies and services for all the workers. My pa says it could mean real prosperity for the whole territory." Sarah smiled at Tommy's enthusiasm, and Jim noted with satisfaction that there was no trace of the old animosity between the children. Sarah's secure place in the community had gradually shifted social dynamics, and Tommy had become one of her genuine friends over the winter months. "That's wonderful news," Sarah said, brushing dirt from her hands. "Papa and I were just talking about how the ranch might expand to meet increased demand for beef." Tommy's eyes widened with the particular awe that Jim had noticed other children displayed around Sarah. Her education, her confidence, and her obvious security in her place at the Broken Arrow Ranch had made her something of a leader among the younger generation in Cedar Ridge. "Are you really going to inherit all this someday?" Tommy asked, gesturing at the vast expanse of ranch land visible from where they stood. "If I prove worthy of it," Sarah replied with the matter-of-fact honesty that characterized all her statements. "Papa says inheritance isn't about deserving something, it's about earning the right to preserve it for the next generation." After Tommy left, promising to return later to help with the garden work, Jim and Sarah continued planting in peaceful companionship. The morning sun climbed higher, warming their backs as they worked, and Jim found himself reflecting on the extraordinary changes the past months had brought to both their lives. The legal challenges from Margaret had quietly disappeared when it became clear that Jim was serious about fighting them, and that the community supported his decision. Margaret still disapproved. Her letters were polite but cool, but she'd apparently decided that maintaining family relationships was more important than pressing her objections. More significantly, Sarah had blossomed in ways that seemed almost miraculous. The quiet, dignified child who'd once whispered about having nothing to eat had become a confident young lady who spoke her mind clearly, pursued her interests with passion, and displayed the kind of natural leadership that suggested remarkable things for her future. "Papa," Sarah said, interrupting his thoughts, "Mrs. Patterson asked me yesterday if I missed not having a mother to teach me about becoming a lady." Jim's hands stilled on the seedling he'd been planting. These moments still caught him off guard, reminders that despite all he could provide, there would always be aspects of Sarah's development that he couldn't fully address. "What did you tell her?" "I told her that I had the best mother in the world for 8 years, even if I don't remember her very well. And I told her that Mama made sure Grandmother could teach me everything I needed to know about being a good woman." Sarah paused, then added with a small smile, "I also told her that you're teaching me things most ladies never learn, like how to run a business and make important decisions for myself." The pride in her voice when she spoke about their partnership in managing the ranch made Jim's chest swell with emotion. Sarah had proven to have remarkable aptitude for the business side of ranching, and he'd begun including her in more and more decisions about the operation. "There's something I want to show you," Jim said, rising from the garden and brushing soil from his knees. "Wait here for just a moment." He went into the house and returned with a small wooden box, the same box where he'd kept his memories of Clara, but now containing something new. He handed it to Sarah with ceremony that made her eyes widen with curiosity. "Open it." Inside, nestled in soft velvet, was a delicate gold locket engraved with intricate scrollwork. Sarah lifted it reverently, her fingers tracing the beautiful design. "It was your mother's," Jim explained. "I gave it to her for her birthday the year before you were born. Inside, there's a tiny portrait of her that she had made for me, and now there's one of you, too." Sarah opened the locket with trembling fingers, revealing the miniature paintings. Clara on one side, young and beautiful, with that gentle smile Jim remembered so well, and Sarah on the other, painted from the Christmas photograph they'd taken together. "Now you'll always carry both your mothers with you," Jim said softly, "the one who gave you life and the one who raised you with such love." Tears sparkled in Sarah's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Will you help me put it on?" As Jim fastened the delicate chain around his daughter's neck, he was struck by how much she resembled Clara in that moment, not just in features, but in the grace with which she received gifts, the way she treasured beautiful things not for their monetary value, but for the love they represented. "There's one more thing," Jim said, settling back onto the ground beside her. "I've been thinking about what you said about earning the right to inherit the ranch. I want you to know that you've already proven yourself worthy of anything I could leave you, but more than that, you've given me something I didn't know I was missing." "Oh, what's that, Papa?" "A reason to build something that will matter beyond my own lifetime. Before you came to live here, I was just accumulating wealth and land. Now I'm building a legacy for someone who understands its real value." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, the locket warm against her throat, her small hand finding his. "Mama was right, you know, in her letter, when she said love sometimes means making the hardest choices. You chose me, even when it was difficult, and that means everything." As they sat together in Clara's memorial garden, surrounded by the flowers that would bloom year after year in tribute to the woman who had shaped both their lives, Jim felt a deep peace settle over him. The whispered plea that had started this journey, "I'm so poor I have nothing to eat," had led to riches beyond anything he'd ever imagined, not the riches of land or cattle or money, though those remained important. The real treasure was this: a daughter who challenged him to be better than he'd thought possible, a purpose that extended beyond his own ambitions, and the knowledge that Clara's greatest gift to the world, their remarkable child, would carry forward the best of all of them into whatever future lay ahead. In the distance, cattle moved peacefully across rolling grassland under an endless blue sky, while closer at hand, new flowers pushed their way toward the light in a garden that would stand as a testament to love's power to transform the humblest beginnings into something beautiful and lasting. Sometimes the hardest truths did indeed come from the smallest voices, and sometimes